All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Scrum at Scale webinar presentation. My name is Alyssa Layden, and I'm the product owner of marketing for Scrum at Scale LLC. Before introducing today's speakers, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. First, to provide you with the best listening experience, all audio lines except for the hosts and the presenters will be muted during the webinar. We will not be utilizing the raise hand functionality. If at any time during the presentation you would like to ask the presenters a question for the Q&A section or add a comment to the discussion, please use the Q&A panel on your console. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to play on demand from both the Scrum at Scale website and the Scrum at Scale YouTube channel within 24 hours. Live viewings and on-demand viewings of Scrum at Scale webinars are eligible for one SEU from the Scrum Alliance. All right, we are now ready to start today's webinar. And for that, I would like to introduce our presenters, Brian Levy and Ernesto Custodio. Ernesto and Brian are certified Scrum at Scale trainers and are here to talk about Agile Portfolio Management with Scrum at Scale. Take it away, Brian and Ernesto.
All right, thank you all for attending. Welcome. I'm gonna let Ernesto actually take the beginning lead because he has the most important part.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending. I think good morning, good afternoon, and possibly good evening applies. So we wanted to talk today about some portfolio management and in particular how to apply some of the Scrum at Scale levels and different roles and also events to it. So during this session, we're going to talk about establishing governance in the process of portfolio management, and in particular, how do we align all the way from the vision down to the work that is being done at the perhaps user level story. We're going to also hit on some prioritization techniques, and then how do we incorporate customer feedback into our development process so that we continue the loop. Okay, so with that, Brian, you want to cover the first item?
First item.
I think we're one slide. Yeah, here we go. And one more.
So for the first item, we want to talk a little bit about portfolio governance. And just to level set, governance is the process we use that organizes people, the processes for governance, organizes the resources to provide guidance and oversight and optimizing value while meeting organizational strategy. So we're actually going to get a group of people together and we're going to figure out how we know that we're actually meeting strategic initiatives of the company while at the same time making sure that we do it in a way that minimizes risk and optimizes the efficiency of our organization. And we do all this within the constraints that are given to us. Now, within this portfolio governance process, you need to make sure that you're aligning everyone's work to the overall goals of the company, that you're doing assessment. When you're assessing to make sure that we're on track, you're implementing not only the work that needs to be done, but also the governance that needs to be made. You're communicating different states so that people are familiar with what they need to do. And you're doing all this, and here's the key, we're focusing on making sure that we can make the right decisions. And this is really important. In most instances, when people discuss Scrum, they're focusing on the team. But when we're talking about portfolio, what we want to do is focus on the executives who are making strategic decisions for the entire company. And because we're focused mainly on decisions that actually provide value to the firm, what we want to do is actually take a really hard, fast look at value containers. When I say value containers, what we mean is these pieces of work and groups of work that actually, whether it's capitalized or expense work, that actually contain value and associated costs for the firm. And we might give you a little bit more in depth, look at what we mean by these value containers. So why don't I actually go to the next slide here? And Ernesto, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. So this view, we actually went back and forth significantly, Brian and I, to set up this view because we wanted to encapsulate a lot of the questions that we normally get when it comes to portfolio management. And that is, hey, first of all, how do we talk to our executives? Or if I'm an executive, what's my role in this agile process when it comes to portfolio management? And the key element here is that the E, which is the executive action team in Scrum at Scale, is responsible for the product and the strategic vision, as well as the strategic objectives and the strategic goals. Once those are set, then you're able to move down the hierarchy into the features, into the epics, and into the user stories, right? So keep in mind that Scrum at Scale does not prescribe any particular terminology. You may use any one designation for these, but the important part is that you actually have a method of getting from your vision, which is normally how the companies begin the conversation around what is being built, and that it leads to some form of team level execution, which in this case we're using user stories as the example because it's one of the most commonly used terms in the industry. And part of our discussion was, well, what's the time horizon? Okay, so what defines a goal or what defines a feature? Well, that's the time horizon, right? And that might be true in some cases, it might not in other organizations. You might have a vision that expands further out or shorter. You might have an objective that is actually maybe even shorter than a year. The important part is not the time itself, but that the resolution from one to the other is able to work in decomposing the value that you're trying to deliver at the higher end. So what we tried to put together was a view that was realistic to what the industry and what we see in the different clients and different places that we have visibility. And the vision is normally something that goes about 5 to 10 years. And a good example of this is nothing more than an example, is to be the global banking provider of choice for small businesses. This is something that the executive team would have a hand and communicate throughout the organization. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is our purpose. The strategic objective is something that has a 1 to 5 year time horizon. Now, the key difference here is that these items, you could have multiple objectives to achieve a vision. So you could actually have multiple items that pertain to this line here. And the same thing applies for the goals. You would have multiple goals to achieve one objective. The goals are more specific. The goals tend to have some form of measurement. So to increase the small business usage of e-banking website by 20%, that would be a goal. And that usually is something that you would want to achieve a little more than one quarter, but less than 1 year. And then when you get into the sprint level, now we're talking about features, and features are something that usually take up more than one sprint to complete, usually 2 sprints, but they're done in less than 1 quarter. Keep in mind, there is no prescription here of terms. So this is to provide you with an example of what we normally see in the industry and the terms that are used, but how you would decompose that value that you're trying to achieve at the higher end all the way down to the execution. And finally, we get to the actual sprint, and that is a sprint goal in terms of what we're trying to deliver within a particular sprint. I'm sorry, that's down here, right? And these are our user stories. These are items that can be completed within a couple of days in order to meet a particular epic, which is something that is achieved with multiple sprints. So you see how you can go up and down and how you estimate these. Brian is going to talk a little bit about that, but there are 2 ways or 2 schools of thoughts. There are those that estimate from the top down. There are those that estimate from the bottom up. And if you would you would agree that you might have seen organizations that do it in different ways. So hopefully that gives you a snapshot as far as how you might be able to decompose the items and deliver the value all the way down to the execution level. Brian, back to you.
All right, so one thing we want to consider when you discuss your Agile portfolio management process is you want to think about the main goal of portfolio management. So in portfolio management, our main goal is to maximize the value that we create with the resources that we have available to us. There is a unsurmountable, innumerable number of items that we can actually work on, but we have limited resources and for which to actually use it. And to that end, when you're setting up your governance process, this is all about conflict management. You're going to actually have conflicts in the future, and you need to prepare for them in advance. And again, we're gathering information to make decisions. So when you think about your value containers, one of the main goals that we have for this is to make sure that what comes out of it is useful information. To that end, what we really want to focus on is making sure that you carefully align strategic priorities throughout your organization. How do we do this, right? We want to make sure that when you're aligning your strategic priorities, this actually occurs throughout the product owner cycle in all parts of it. You also need to keep in mind that what we're going to focus on for best practices here is a process of decomposition. So we're going to start at the highest level and break things down into smaller and smaller pieces. And then finally, I'm going to reiterate this over and over again, each of those, the value containers we talked about earlier, they need to have the same characteristics so that you can develop metrics that have meaning. Because only when the metrics have meaning can you actually make decisions. So again, in doing this alignment, we're going to start out, as we discussed earlier, with the vision. And what we're going to do once we actually create this vision is we'll look at where we are right now, which is our mission. We look at the vision, and then we do a gap analysis. How do we actually get from our mission to our vision? And that should result in your strategic objectives. And when you think about how do we make those strategic objectives more measurable? Once you decompose your objective, you should arrive at your strategic goals. Now we're going to introduce something interesting. What we've seen is best practices is to actually take these goals, and again, it's a strategy. You don't have all the information you need to make some decisions. You're developing your goals, developing your objectives based on some assumptions. So what we're going to do is ask you to go through your strategic goals that you actually made more concrete and measurable. And once you actually go through those, we're going to ask you to write down all the assumptions related to those goals. And once you actually label out those assumptions, what we want to do next is figure out what pieces of those assumptions can you actually validate. And that's how you'll actually develop your scale sprint goals. So you'll take the strategic objectives down to your goals, down to your assumptions, down to your scale sprint goals. And as long as you're decomposing in this way, you can be assured to have alignment throughout your project, throughout your process, throughout your organization, because everything moves through these steps in this order. This is how you maintain the alignment. Now, I want to throw out one more item with this. As you go from this high level, from your strategic goal, through your assumptions, through your scale sprint goal, to your individual team sprint goals, what you'll notice is that we're going to focus a lot on the assumptions. Now, let's just go over definitions of assumptions. Assumptions are items that you are acting upon as if they were true, but you don't really know. Because you don't know if they're true, there's an element of risk that you could be incorrect. So for each assumption that you have, because it has an element of risk, you're going to identify what that risk is. And once you identify it, you need to actually develop some way to validate whether that risk is true or false. And once you develop that way of validating whether that risk is true or false, and sometimes we call that a hypothesis test, you're going to take the test that you need to validate, and then taking that test that you need to validate, that's how you actually form your scaled sprint goal. You'll think about, for the next sprint, in order to perform this test, can I do the whole test in one sprint? And if so, then I can make the whole hypothesis test just that portion. Or you could run into a scenario where the test is too big. Maybe I have to develop something in order to prepare for the test. And if that's the case, then the portion that you can actually develop within the time box that you have for the sprint, then you want to actually make that your goal. And once you do this repeatedly, you'll get more and more information, more and more resources necessary, and so you can finally validate that your assumption is either correct or incorrect. Now, this is extremely important. If your assumption is incorrect, then your strategy, which affects the entire organization, is wrong. You're moving in the wrong direction, so you need to change it as fast as possible. And this is why leading with the strategic objective and strategic goals and deriving the work top down is so important. If you start bottom up, yeah, you can build things, but the things that people are building, they may not be aligned to the overall goal of the organization. And if that happens, again, you leave room for the rest of the organization not to be aligned with what you're developing. What we want to do is make sure everyone's aligned, everyone's working towards the same goal. And by making sure in a continuous effort that the work that's done at the team level are actually supporting directly the strategic objectives that you have for the organization. That's how you can make sure that you're aligned all the time. Now, one thing's going to happen I'm going to make note of. At the base level of Scrum, at the team level, the sprint ends in the sprint review. And the purpose of that sprint review is to obtain feedback, so you should have something that you can demonstrate to a customer. So you're gathering data and you're using that to reprioritize. When you're doing things in Agile Portfolio Management, the product managers, the leaders of your organization, they should gather all this feedback that is produced. And when they gather that feedback, they're going to consolidate it, and they're going to look at the impact that that feedback has to validating the assumptions they have for their strategy. And if too many things are wrong and don't agree with the direction of their strategy, you need to change it, right? So this is the loop that's created when you actually start from the top. I'm going to pause for a second and invite Ernesto to actually come back in and give his views on how we actually make this all work.
Sure thing, Brian. And we actually got a very good question asked online that pertains to this. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay now. I did have a bit of a choppy audio before. And that was, how do you transition from a PMO mindset to making this work? And the key element is in separating the what from the how as far as strategic organizations go within the company. So you would have a organization that we call the EAT, that's the executive action team, that focuses on the execution, on how do we make this go to the work that where it needs to get done and executing that work. Then we have the Meta Scrum, that is the organization or the group of individuals that are primarily made up of product owners and chief product owners that are taking it all the way from the strategic vision and breaking that down all the way down to the actual sprint goal as it goes from chief product owner to chief product owner and down to the individual product owners. So you would identify items that are of the highest priority by prioritizing it. And by the way, priority is singular, is not plural, right? That means you wouldn't have multiple priorities competing, but that you would stack rank these priorities in a form of a product backlog, something that can bring you all the way down in terms of knowing what is most important so that it can be divided between the different chief product owners and the execution of those items. Take into consideration the risks that you have and also the customer feedback that needs to be applied and what might be your cost of not developing that in a shorter amount of time, your cost of delay. All of these are taking into consideration as you prioritize it all the way through from the epic level product backlog that gets divided into the user story or essentially more refined product backlog items, but sticking with our examples of how does it apply from the goals to the epics to the user stories. It's essentially looking at the risks, looking at the feedback and looking at the cost of delay as inputs that allow you to prioritize it all the way down to the execution. Yeah. And we do have one question from Jack, if that is to clarify. If I'm understanding correctly, the response is that you recommend taking the how away from the development teams. No, by no means, by no means. So let me clarify that. So if we, Brian, can we go to the framework picture, which is in the second slide, all the way up so that we can see the entire framework? There we go. It's small, but I think it still drives the point. What this is emphasizing, everything works together. And there are some meeting points, and those meeting points are the team level process. If you see here, you actually have a team level process that crosses both. That crosses the Meta Scrum. This is the what we're going to be built. And it also crosses the boundary of the executive action team. This is how we're going to build it. At the team level, the development team, the Scrum Master, and the product owner are working together as they always have been. There is no change in how the teams are expected to work together in Scrum at Scale. What is communicated here is that at the executive level, you do have two groups of individuals that are empowered to make decisions. One around the product lifecycle and determining what needs to be created and what is the priority for that, starting all the way at the vision. And then you also have the Scrum Master lifecycle. That is a group of executives that are responsible for determining how the teams are working together for removing impediment as one of their primary responsibilities to ensure that the teams remain productive to deliver on that. So there is a leadership separation of the what and the how. The execution comes together always at the team level. Hopefully it's clear.
So there was a question over here on how often is recommended to inspect the assumptions and risks that you may have at meta scrum level or E level. And really the answer to that is what we're doing in Scrum at Scale should be in Agile Portfolio Management should be a constant process of evaluating the assumptions. Because again, if you base your strategy on the assumptions and the assumptions are incorrect, then your strategy is wrong. So you should constantly validate throughout the life of the organization, throughout the life of every product, that these assumptions are correct. And what we're actually displaying here is, here's the way you do it, right? Now, again, in Agile, we don't want to actually just make assumptions and take things at face value. We want proof. But at the end of every sprint, we should actually have something to provide as proof. And what should we provide as proof? We should have actually determined that in the beginning in sprint planning. So for every sprint, I should actually not only have a sprint goal, but actually have some metrics over, here's how I know that this sprint goal has been reached. Here's how I know that the sprint goal is the right goal, right? And as you're doing this, you go through a process where you're validating constantly. Every sprint, you're validating something. And that way, your organization is always on the right path. There was another question here. What are the matrix which are collected at portfolio levels? And I'm not clear on what we mean by the word matrix. I think we may mean metrics. And if you're looking at metrics, the things that you really care about are the things that are important for your organization. There was a very famous book that I absolutely love that's called How to Measure Anything. And it's made by Douglas Hubbard. And what Douglas Hubbard speaks about in this book is that when you look at what metrics really are, metrics are a way to quantify risks. So whatever I'm afraid of, whatever I think is risky, I look at it and I should try to quantify the most important ones. So again, because assumptions, each assumption has some element of risk. As you look at the assumptions, the same way that we look at risk, and usually we have a risk description. And we also have a risk probability, right? And I like to use a scale of 1 to 10, but 10 being the highest probability that the assumption is incorrect. And then I'll have a risk impact. Again, I use a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, that if this assumption, this risk is incorrect, here's how big an impact it's going to have in my organization. And I multiply these things together and get an overall magnitude. And because I use a scale of 1 to 10, the highest magnitude I can get is 100. And so I'll take all my assumptions and multiply these things out. I have the highest assumptions at the top. If it has the biggest probability of that my assumption is incorrect and my business case is based on it, then these are the ones that could actually transform the way I'm doing business and take my organization if I'm going the wrong way. And if they also have the biggest impact, so if I'm wrong about it, it'll completely destroy things, I should address those first. Right? So I always keep, as an executive team, we keep our kind of assumption register, and we prioritize the assumptions by their probability and impact. And again, we just take it one at a time. So we're constantly trying to figure out, well, how do we validate this assumption is correct? Let's work out to the teams and actually do this work. In our meta scrums, the things that we may find out that the things that we need to build in order to test out the assumptions take a really long time to do and take multiple teams. And so I may need a meta scrum to actually coordinate multiple teams to divide up the effort and do some of the work, right? But again, whatever I need is proof. As we come up with the hypothesis that we need to test, at the same time, we'll actually think about how do we measure things and how do we know it's on the right track. And those are the metrics that we'll track as an organization. So there's another question here that I wanted to address. The question here says, I'm confused on why we'd ask the executives, to be focused on the how. Well, I want to make sure you know that we are in no way saying that your high-level executives should try to figure out how to actually build the product. We do want the executives to actually look at the overall risks and the assumptions around the strategy. And we do want them focused on how do they validate that that strategy is correct. And only they have that information because they developed this strategy. And so they know what they need as comfort to know that things are on the right path. So again, we're not saying that the executive team actually should figure out how to build the product. We're actually saying that the executive team should figure out how to actually go ahead and validate that the strategy is correct. So hopefully this makes sense. There were a couple people that came in late, so I wanted to make sure that I did a quick recap of everything we've discussed so far. Again, we started out by describing Agile Portfolio Management. And in it, we started out by saying you need a governance function to make sure that you are focusing the organization and organizing them properly so you have oversight and guidance and making the right decisions on the assets for the organization. And in order to do that, their main focus should be on value containers. And what are value containers? So we talked about our value containers. We take the gap between the mission and vision, and we come up with the strategic objectives. And we break those down to make them more measurable, to come up with strategic goals. And we break those down to come up with features. And we break those down to come up with epics. And we break those down and ship them off to the teams at story level, right? And that's how we actually make sure that everything's aligned. If I ask why a story exists, you should be able to look up and see that it exists because it's actually implementing an epic. And that epic is implementing a feature. And that feature is implementing a goal, right? As you do this, part of that governance function is going to look at, well, what metrics does a firm need to actually keep track of? And one of the metrics the firm needs to keep track of, we actually need to look at whatever is risky in our organization. And it's going to differ by organization and based on what you're doing. And I mentioned a book that actually gives great guidance on this, How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard, right? Someone asked me a question on making sure I gave the author's name, Douglas Hubbard, Hubbard. But in this book, what he describes is that if you're having, metrics shouldn't be arbitrary, and they really shouldn't be the same for every firm. You should actually think about what's risky for your firm. And if you're having trouble actually coming up with metrics, the problem is that you haven't defined what it is you're trying to measure enough.
if you refine your definition, then the metrics become easier, right? So that's the process we want to go through. And as you get things into your value container, again, because you're breaking things down from this high level vision to our objectives, to our goals, to our features, to our epics, to user stories, everything will always be in alignment, right? And again, your EMS is going to actually make sure that when I say EMS, it's your executive meta scrum. This is your executives that are in charge of the strategy at the highest level of your organization. They're going to be responsible for making sure that all these things break down properly. Now, here's the key, because we talked about how to implement governance. Anything, again, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to point out this last statement, that your value containers have the same characteristics. And what do I mean by characteristics? Well, we talked about your user stories. They should fit inside of the sprint, right? So someone needs to check to make sure that every single user story actually fits within the sprint, right? Someone should make sure that all of your epics, what we do at I think a few of my clients is we make sure that all the epics belong to one team. So when a team actually goes into a meta scrum, they pull out the work that that team is going to do that we agreed that they do. And it could be bigger than a sprint, but they pull it out. But it can only be work that can be done by that team or that team is committing to do, right? So it goes into their backlog. And that way, as long as we have the rules where each epic applies to a team, then if I'm going to track costs, if I know the cost of every team, I know the size of the epics, I can actually derive the costs per team, right? Which is important for our administrative purposes to make decisions at a higher level. The goals that we have, right? We should have measurements for each of those, right? So again, I want to make sure that you know that as you go through, your governance is making sure that every single item that you have in this hierarchy or value containers has the same characteristics. So there's a question here that shouldn't it be epic and then feature to story? Now, what I want you to keep in mind is that we have this hierarchy of these value containers, and the names of the value containers don't matter. You're probably going to use different names at your company. You're going to customize those. What matters is the characteristics at each level. And let me give you an example. Well, the characteristics that we use for features at a lot of my clients is that features are items that actually can be completed within a quarter. One, so they're a quarter or less. And two, we divide them up so that each feature either has to be all capitalized or all expense. And we separate those so we can actually accumulate costs and do financial reporting for the entire organization based on those features. And remember, all your epics and stories are going to be tied to the features. So again, the question about should they be named differently? Or shouldn't an epic be bigger than a feature? It's just a name. The important thing is the characteristics that you have at each level, right? If I were to actually say that an epic had those characteristics, that yeah, you end up switching them, but it's just a name change. I could also name these things, something crazy like A, B, C, D at different levels. But again, it's the characteristics that matter. There's another question on here on how do you define business cases or other financial goals, and at what level, and who does it? What we normally require in organizations that I've worked with, so what I've seen as best practices, is that ultimately the EMS is responsible for the highest level business cases. So it's at the EMS level, the highest level, the executive level in the company. Now, also best practices is all ideas don't come from the top. So if anyone has an idea in the company, they're responsible for putting together a business case for their idea. What we do is at the top of the organization, the business cases are a little bit more rigorous. But when people have ideas, we actually give them mini business cases. And usually they're like one-pagers. And if they appeal to the executives of the organization, then they'll follow up to get more information. Excellent question. I'm gonna tackle another question here. There's another question on what would be another name for, or an example of a value container? We call them value container. People sometimes call them work types. People also call them story hierarchies. But again, it's whatever represents work that your organization does. So pretty much universally across all of the world of Agile, the work that a story does within a sprint is universally called a story, right? And once you get above that level, the names kind of vary. So I won't get into that piece of it, but the hierarchy that you would have in a tool like Rally or Jira, whatever you actually are using to track your work, that's what we're calling value containers. The reason we call them value containers is because what we want to focus our organization on for portfolio management is actually the creation and the management of value. When we call them other things like work, what we found is that psychologically, people tend to just treat them just like work. There's just something to do. And they don't give it the care and the focus of making sure that is the things that they do, the work, is valuable to the people that we're actually trying to do it for, our customers. And that's why we give it that name. But again, you can use different names. There's another question here. And the question here is about the funnel past the fact that teams receive full epics. How does the EAT and Metascrum direct epics into the teams? So what we do is we have the executive, the EMS and the executive Metascrums to actually create the objectives. And from those objectives, what we try to do is we say, we need to break these down and we need to track it. So in order to break it down and track it, we need all these objectives to be broken down by the people that are going to be in charge of each objective. And a lot of my clients, they ask them to be broken down in kind of quarterly milestones. So here's this big objective, and the objective may take multiple years, but we're like, hey, you know what? You can't actually just have a yearly objective, and we're just going to trust that you met it at the end of 3 years. You need to break it down to a goal that can be met within a year, right? And normally, department heads of an organization, a lot of times they're VPs at large organizations or directors at medium-sized ones. They're in charge of actually making sure that they take the objectives and break them down into one-year goals. And then from the goal level, we actually ask that different teams get together. And we say teams about Metascrums. And each of those Metascrums, usually they're led by, we call them by different names, but a lead kind of product manager. They actually take the goals and break those down to say, here's what we're actually going to do within a quarter. And the measurements and breakdowns of the quarters are what we call features. Those are things we deliver to our customers within the quarter. So usually that's the realm of product management. And again, we have a product manager or a lead product manager in charge of our meta scrums. And the meta scrums are actually attended by, and we have a product manager representative who's leading the meta scrum. And we have product owners who attend from the teams that we're actually going to implement it. And we have the product owners in the meta scrum say, all right, once I understand what the features are, each team, because they're prioritizing those features, they figure out what they can do or what their teams can do to deliver on that piece. So they voluntarily say, hey, let's break it down this way. And our team wants to take this piece. So the product owner on behalf of the team grabs the piece that their team is able to do and want to do. And they take it back, those epics, the piece that they grab from the feature, they take those back into their backlogs, take it back to the team. And then you have your regular team level process of taking the epics that are prioritized, breaking them down into stories that are consumable. So that's basically the funnel as we go through, going from this high level to the low level. Now, there's another question here on, do we have, I'm going to skip the one on case studies because we won't have time to actually present one, but we'll try to get you that information later. But there's a question here is, I'm missing the EMT, and I'm guessing they mean EMS, in the value container slide. Can you please explain where it's positioned? Right, so, and that's a mistake on our part. Really, what we should have done here, and I'm gonna, sorry, go back to the slide, it moved on me. But right when we have E here, we should also have EMS. So EMS mainly does the items for the products that get created. But again, some of what needs to get created from an objective standpoint is about operations, is about the how. So we have two different types of objectives. Objectives about products and objectives about how we do our operations. And all those get funneled into goals, broken down to features, into epics and stories. So that was an excellent question. Let's see, I'm going down our list of questions here. So there's another question here on, let me go down. All right, so I'm reading one that says, I'm going to help 4 branches of agencies. Each agency has their own product owner right now, and all send their epic stories to just one Scrum team. How do I get them to choose just one product owner? All right, so the question is basically, hey, I've got multiple stakeholders. I've only got one team doing the work. So how do we get one product owner and get these teams to agree? And this is where governance comes in, right? I need to get the leads of each group. And what I usually do is I throw in the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is, hey, what happens if all 4 of you have a different priority on what needs to be done first? And if you all have a different priority on what needs to be done first, how are we going to solve that? And usually I'll say, hey, you're responsible for telling me how it's going to work, so I get one priority. Then I leave. And lots of times they fight it out. It takes weeks. But every time I've done that, when they actually, I told them to come up with a policy of how do I know what thing to do first and what the priorities are. They've always come back and said, all right, we're going to give you one representative. And you'll just listen to that person. Don't take advice from all 4 of these people. And once you do that, you end up having a chief product owner in charge. And so that's how you get down to one. You know, I've used that technique multiple times, and it's worked a lot. All right. So right now I'm doing a quick time check, and I'm doing the time check because, again, lots of people there was lots of different questions, but we usually try to do a wrap up at the end of each webinar. So if you get those last undying questions, feel free to ask those now, and I'll try to answer them. And then we'll do a wrap up, and we'll exit in about 5 minutes from now. There is one of those dying questions is there any feedback loop starting with devs upward to the goals to validate assumptions about the timeframes? And that's an excellent question. And I'll have to do a little bit of drawing, and you'll have to excuse me because I'm a terrible, terrible artist, but I want to explain how this works. So what tends to happen, remember I talked about having metrics, right? And what this metrics and transparency is all about is the executive meta scrum and your executive action team, when they send their items into the backlog, they're also going to actually be responsible for figuring out how do they know that these items are being completed properly. So they're going to create metrics. And not only will they create metrics at the high level, they have to think about how those metrics are going to be collected. So for each of the levels of the work types, we're going to have collection procedures of how we gather this data and turn it into useful information, all the way down to team level. And everything the team level does, this information gets inside of that metric and transparency item. They get collected. And this information gets fed back up through the procedures created to the Eaton EMS. Because again, remember, earlier we talked about, they're going to have not only this risk register and the assumption register, they're also going to have for each assumption hypothesis test, like how do I test it? They're also going to have metrics for collection. So they're going to make sure that the organization collects the data, because remember, this whole thing about portfolio management that we talked about earlier, it focuses on decisions. So they want the information to make the decision. Every decision that they're going to make, the executives are in charge of having a decision register. And in the decision register, they actually label out what criteria they're using to make the decision and the associated metrics that will be used to fulfill the criteria. So because they're focused on making decisions, they're going to ask for this data, actually demand it from the Scrum teams. It's one of the most important things that they actually want and they'll ask for. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go back to, whoops, because we're in that question and answer period. I'm going to answer all the last minute questions that come in, because we still have 2 more minutes, I think, to answer questions before the wrap up. And one person says, hey, we use OKRs. Do you think that meets similar criteria of the objectives and your goals? And yes, the basis of OKRs is, the basis of OKRs really are objectives, right? So it fits right into our value containers. And each of those containers, when I have an objective in OKRs, I also have, I think they call them operational objectives that are based on risks, right? So it's actually a very similar type process that we're using for OKRs. I think this will be the last question we can answer before we have to wrap up. And that is, regarding the Scrum teams, is there any communication channel, or do they learn, and how do they learn about the value containers? So again, this goes into the governance. When the organization actually, because again, for governance, the organization has to figure out the characteristics of the value containers and the rules that they're going to put in place to make sure that the value containers have similar characteristics, right? As part of rolling out that governance, earlier we talked about the steps that happen in governance. I'm going to go back to this. And if you notice, one of the steps is communicate the state. So the governance organization is going to go out and they're going to train everyone. Most of the places that are actually using Agile Portfolio Management, it rolls down through the EMS. So the EMS actually works with the chief product owners of the meta scrums, and those chief product owners of the meta scrums actually work with the product owners, and the product owners actually make sure that they bring all this information back to the team. So you have this communication channel that rolls down from the top of the organization to the very bottom. And that's how everything is communicated properly. Now, unfortunately, according to my watch, we're almost at the end of our webinar here. So I think at this point, I talked to Alyssa earlier, and I asked her if I could use my game show voice to bring her back in. So at this point, I have to say, all right, back to you, Alyssa.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you to you, Brian, and also to Ernesto, who unfortunately had to jump about halfway through the call, but we saw a ton of questions. Thank you so much for today's presentation. And I did want to say before everyone leaves that the recording of today's presentation, as well as a PDF export of all of the slides, will be available on our website, scrumatscale.com, within 24 hours. And if you would like to follow up with Brian or Ernesto with any additional questions, their information can be found on the trainer directory on the website as well. All right, and that's all that I have. Thank you so much, Brian.
I just want to thank everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks everyone.